You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Gunther Bensch, a researcher at the RWI Leibniz Institute for Economic Research in Germany. His work studies development policies related to household energy usage, and much of his recent focus has been on countries like India and Senegal. Specifically, he studied how to increase access to improved cooking technology and improved electrical appliances like lights. So thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm very excited for this discussion. And I know that we're going to talk about a bunch of very fascinating details today. But first of all, I'd just love to hear a little bit of context about who you are and how you really got started working in this field.
Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Gunther Bensch. I'm researcher at RWI, which is an economic research institute in Essen in Germany. And I'm working in two research groups at the institute. One is called Environment and Resources, and the other one, Climate Change in Developing Countries. And that's actually, let's say, reflects quite well with my work. So this intersection, on the one hand, resources, and on the other hand, also this research with a certain focus on developing countries. And I would say this interest somehow originated, let's say at your age. My main question was to see that we somehow deal somewhat carelessly with natural resources. And then over the time, I then asked myself, okay, do I rather want to go towards engineering or towards some social science? And then in the end, I thought, okay, I'm more interested in the human side of it. But then I saw that energy would be one issue that still keeps me somehow at this intersection between the technical questions and the social questions. And that was what also intrigues me most with this research, is that you always have very much a combination of the two things. So, for example, when we think about improved cook stoves, which is one thing that I was working heavily on, it's very much a question of, okay, how do we bring those stoves that are working perfectly in the lab, where engineers are doing a perfect job, how do we bring them to people to really adopt them and to use them? And there is like a myriad of questions that is coming there along the way in terms of technical questions, but also social economic questions. And that is what, let's say, what in a nutshell brought me to this topic. And then maybe at another layer, it's also interesting that you really go from not only from the technical side to the social side, but also it's things about very basic questions like cooking. So how do people cook? What do they eat? And how does it relate to the choice of stoves? To very systemic questions of how to provide electricity in areas that are so far unelectrified, and which technologies to choose. So this is more about very broad questions of electricity planning.
Yeah.
And here I am.
So I think what's especially fascinating is that if you're not familiar with this area of work, you'd assume that the issue here is that, say you mentioned the example of cook stoves, the issue is that we don't have the right kind to go put out in these countries. But as you mentioned, it's not that. The more fascinating thing is, what are the cultural barriers that get in the way when you actually want to convince someone to go buy one of these? So we're going to dive into those details. But I think, first of all, let's start with the simple aspects, starting with the technical details. So the appliances that are often lacking in these developing countries, they're not usually laptops or computers or the electronics we think about. There are different kinds of appliances that are very key to just basic economic development, right?
Yes, it is. I mean, it is two things. One thing is economic development. So in how far appliances, machines drive economic development. But then it is maybe also a more basic question about quality of life of people. Because when you think about cooking, you may not directly relate it to economic development, but it is more a question about basic energy services that people need to avail of in a safe, in a reliable, and in a clean manner, right? And then when you think beyond cooking, when you go into electric appliances, then again, you start with appliances that are maybe more related to, let's say, basic necessities like lighting and information from radio, from TV, right? So these are again more fundamental devices that are required in order to live like a decent life, but that not necessarily trigger what we may consider as economic development, which may bring people out of also economic poverty traps.
Yeah, I think that distinction is very important. And I am wondering, let's say we look at the status quo of the issue, which regions is this problem worst in, not having these types of appliances?
Well, when you think about regions, maybe it's easiest to split the question up into two broader types. So one is cooking and the other is electric energy. So since electric energy is typically or is often not necessarily used for cooking, we make this distinction. So we make the distinction between cooking and then any other electricity access. And when we think about electricity access, we see that we currently have about 10% of the world population that still lacks access to electricity. And here the problem is most pronounced in sub-Saharan Africa, and that is particularly because in other areas like in Asia, we saw over the past 20 years like a huge increase in the availability of electricity. But here, let's say a second layer beyond the availability of electricity is the reliability, and there we also in many areas where we have electricity, for example, in areas like India or Bangladesh, in some areas we still observe issues with the reliability of electricity. So in India, at least, there has recently been quite an improvement in reliability, but that is something that we always still have to have in mind.
And when it comes to cooking, the situation is a bit different. Africa again has a high share of people that lack access to modern energy. In rural areas, the share is below 5%. But in terms of absolute numbers, Asia still has a higher number of people that lack access to clean energy technologies, notably China and India.
But the type of lack is more profound in sub-Saharan Africa because there people really cook with very, very basic stoves. So you wouldn't even be able to call it a stove. It's more 3 stones that people use to put a pot on it. Whereas in Asia, there we at least have some availability of what we would call transition technologies, like basic stoves, which we wouldn't call clean and which wouldn't conform to the standards we have, but which at least are a bit more improved than these very basic 3-stone stoves.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into exactly these different types. So let's say, what are the types of fuels being used in different stoves? Are we talking, say, basic lighting like kerosene lamps, or even the specifics there? And what are the downsides? Like, why is it bad that these people are not using something like an electric cook stove?
Well, when we think about electricity, one main downside is that electricity is a precondition for economic development. I mean, it's not necessarily the binding constraint in many areas. That means bringing electricity doesn't necessarily push economic development in these areas, but it is a precondition. So together with other factors like other infrastructure and institutional settings and the like, so together you form, let's say, an ecosystem where economic development can thrive. And of course, you also have what we would call then consumptive uses of electricity, where you would say it creates convenience, it brings you information, lighting is sometimes also associated with a freer availability of time, which in one particular aspect may help, for example, students to learn more in the evening. And kerosene lighting is, of course, also, well, a polluting lighting source. But all that, one has to acknowledge that these factors are much less pronounced than for cooking, because cooking with biomass is much more adverse to the livelihood of the local rural population, and that is one because of health aspects. So the smoke of open fire is just very detrimental to the health. WHO, for example, they estimate that 4 million people worldwide die annually in a premature way because of cooking-related household pollution. And this is in particular an aspect that affects women more drastically, because they are typically the ones who are in charge of cooking, but who are also in charge of collecting the firewood. So it's also a question of time availability, and then in a broader sense of gender equity. And beyond that, we have, let's say, the societal problems of cooking, which is the effect on forest degradation and on climate, because cooking with solid fuels, among others, is one important source of black carbon. I mean, science is not yet completely sure about the effect, and it's also very location specific what the effect of this black carbon is, but it is generally acknowledged that this is an important driver of climate change.
Yeah, very fascinating how all of these different topics keep on combining and layering on top of each other. And I think for me, that's one of the things that makes it fascinating. It's like you just think it's this small device, just lighting. But as you said, there are real people cooking with these devices, real students trying to learn at night, and they might not have been able to. So I think it's a very fascinating and rewarding area of work when you're trying to get better solutions out there. And that's what I want to transition into now. So we understand a little bit of the technological aspect, but now there's this immense social aspect. And I wanted to ask about the different types of policies we have to distribute these types of modern devices, whether for cooking, for lighting, etc., and some of the big barriers that are still making them, not as great as we'd like them to be.
Yeah, I think barriers is a good point, because in the end, an effective intervention is one that manages to well address those barriers, right? And their research has did quite some effort to understand what are the barriers for the adoption. And one obvious and main barrier, both for electricity and for cooking, is affordability. When you think, for example, about an electricity connection in rural areas, it will cost at least $500 per household, right? And that is something that a poor rural household will not be able to afford. And similarly, cook stoves oftentimes suffer from this affordability issue. And then a second main aspect is that the available technologies are not necessarily well adapted to the local conditions, and not necessarily providing their service in a reliable manner. For example, when you think about, as I said, electricity, you have the issue that you have problems with reliability, in particular then in rural areas. When you think about cooking gas, there is the issue of reliable distribution channels, which make people then resort back to traditional energy sources. And when you think about cook stoves, you also see that, I mean, the improved technologies, that they sometimes do not match that well the day-to-day cooking habits of people. To give just one example, I've been doing research in Senegal, and there an average household size in the area where I've been working was 13 people. And that means you have cooking pots that are 10 liters and more, so very huge cooking pots that just do not match the more modern stove types that are out there. So let's focus on these 2 points of affordability and technologies, because there we can think of initiatives and of policies to address that. And one obvious way to address affordability is to make end user prices lower, so to provide public subsidies. And one, let's say, maybe more famous example from recent past is from India. People living below the poverty line received free cooking gas cylinders. So that means the price has been reduced. And then another aspect that has been introduced in that policy was that people could pay the first refill of that cylinder over time. So that means beyond affordability, that people may just not be able to make huge upfront investments. The main downside of that is, of course, to make sure that public money is provided in a sustainable manner, that the public funds are made available also beyond a political cycle of certain politicians. And that is something that we've seen, which in some countries haven't necessarily always worked out well, or where just countries have seen that the weight of the subsidies was just too high. For example, countries like Senegal and Ghana, they have reduced certain fuel subsidies, and what we've seen was that people then resort back to the traditional energy sources quite quickly. So that is, of course, something that we have to have in mind when we think about subsidization. So that needs to be something that is really done in a sustainable manner. And then about the second aspect of available technologies, there again are different ways to do it. One, having talked about the technological and the economic part of it, we can think of interventions that address more the technological aspect, where we just give grants for research and development, for example. And then another economic approach that you could combine with it would be to trigger more private sector involvement in these areas. In particular, in the stove sector, we've seen that many of those activities were driven by large public governmental agencies, and they've often been found to not necessarily provide the best solutions to the needs of the people. So, for example, what has become a bit popular in recent past is what is called results-based financing, where agencies try to involve private actors more into the deployment of those technologies.
Yeah, that's a very amusing term to me, results-based financing, because it's like, oh yeah, that's how businesses work. So that makes sense to me. And I know that there are so many other complicated details that you could dive into there, but the one that I'm most curious about is one that I found when I was diving through your work actually, which is that even when we do solve the economic and the technological challenges, sometimes the effects, the results of our, say, policies, they're not exactly what we expect. Like if we're measuring the number of people that, or families that actually go adopt and get new lighting or stoves, well, sometimes it's higher than we expect, sometimes it's lower than we expect. And correct me if I'm wrong, but one of your recent papers from Senegal found that the difference just came out to be how you were telling families about what these stoves are. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that adds to these barriers that I just mentioned, right? So beyond affordability and technological aspects, there are also issues that, I mean, we as economists would maybe call more behavioral aspects of the issue of technology adoption. At least from our point of view, it would be very rational to adopt a highly efficient cook stove, which doesn't cost so much. But then you have additional barriers. They may be behavior barriers where there is just an inattention to this problem, just because there is a myriad of more pressing or other pressing needs, and it's even not clear whether this belongs to the area of behavioral economics, so that is not irrational, or whether you could also just argue it's completely rational to prioritize, and that maybe cooking is just one aspect that comes at a lower point of the pecking order. But I think that another important barrier that also contributes to the point that cooking is so low at the pecking order is the aspect of gender equity. and that in many of the cases that we were working with, that they just suffer from a low decision power about the choice of technologies that are bought by the household. And in that sense, another complementary policy is initiatives to empower women. Well, in that sense, you coming back to your question, you see that even if you manage to overcome maybe one or two barriers, you will see that there are other barriers that then do not bring about the change that you were thinking about.
Yeah, and this actually gets to the last area of questions I have for you, which is around the field more so. The general field of figuring out how to design economic, technological, social, all of these different aspects to work together so we can actually solve this problem. And there are two big questions I have for you. The first big question is, what do you think is holding back the progress we're making on this field?
Well, first of all, maybe we have to see that in terms of electricity access, we are quite on a good track to come at least close to what we defined in terms of SDG 7, so this Sustainable Development Goal 7 on energy access, which says that until 2030, we are supposed to reach 100% electrification. And there we are on a good track to come close to that. But you're right, when it comes to improved cooking, we will unlikely reach that target in 2030. We will still have a huge number of people who cook with very traditional and basic technologies. And so what is the barrier? I honestly, I cannot really give you an answer to that, because it is this conundrum of various barriers that I was referring to before. And we as research, we haven't yet really figured out what are the key barriers to it. And that is definitely something where we will have to dive deeper into to understand how these different factors interact with each other.
Yeah, I think, that just gives more room to grow in this field, especially for future economists, social scientists, etc., that will be entering it later. And last question of the day, when it comes to this field moving forward, what do you think are some of the most underexplored areas or the open questions that still need to be answered?
Well, I already mentioned this aspect of the interrelatedness between the different barriers. So what we in our research often try to do is to first of all get a better understanding of each factor individually. And now the next step would be to bring that together and see, also given that of course these different factors interact with each other, to understand better what are then the key factors holding us from achieving wider uptake of those technologies. And other areas where we might want to see more research on, or where we have certain research gaps, maybe when we think about the impact of those technologies in the first place, right? Because when we think about, okay, how important is it for us as public policy to push those technologies, we of course first have to understand better the impacts, and we've done quite some progress on that. But for example, when we think about stoves and their climate impacts, and also about the health impacts, there is still a lot to explore about. Maybe one more concrete aspect that I think will also be important to look at will be the fact that we see the lack of energy access will be more and more concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. And here we see a combination of population growth and of urbanization. And at the same time, we know that in urban areas, the preferred fuel is charcoal. So this question of how these different factors then drive future charcoal consumption and what the impacts on the environment are, that is definitely an intriguing question that I think that we will also try to address more in the future.
Yeah, I saw one of your research papers that actually, I think, was talking about how many lights, LEDs or other types of lights, are ending up in the waste after they have been used. So people hadn't thought about those kinds of afterwards effects, but we now have to deal with them. So it definitely is a very evolving field. There's a lot of work to be done, and I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through everything from the status quo to now where we can look forward to seeing developments in the future.
Well, thank you very much. I very much appreciated the talk.